You have never lost a war, not once, not a skirmish, not a siege, not a campaign that lasted years across 3 continents. You have reduced empires to footnotes. You have made kings beg. You have turned the steppes of Central Asia into the throne room of the most fearsome military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Your name is not just feared, it is whispered. Even in lands where they do not know your language, they know the sound of hooves on dry earth, and they know what it means. You are the fist of the Mongol Empire, and the world has been soft clay in your hands. And then one day, at the edge of a frozen river, somewhere in the tangled forests of the East, you come face to face with something your intelligence scouts never warned you about. Men who do not run, men who do not break formation when they should, men who laugh when they should pray, men who, when your arrows have darkened the sky above them, simply raise their shields and walk forward. You have seen bravery before. You've burned it. You've buried it. This is something else entirely. This is the moment, lost somewhere between myth and chronicle, that the most feared conquerors in history met something ancient and immovable. A culture forged not in the warmth of civilization, but in the cold of the sea, in the dark of winter, in the silence between thunderclaps. This is the story of the battle that made the Mongols afraid, and it is about far more than 2 armies colliding in the snow. The first world is the Mongol world. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in all of human history. It stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Central Europe. Under Genghis Khan, and then his sons and grandsons, the Mongols had developed a military philosophy that was, in its time, nothing short of revolutionary. They were not simply warriors. They were a system. Mongol commanders understood something that most medieval armies did not. War is not about who is bravest in the field. War is about information, mobility, logistics, and psychology. Before a Mongol army arrived at your city walls, they already knew your patrol routes, your garrison numbers, your political fractures, and the name of the general you trusted least. They sent spies disguised as merchants. They cultivated informants. They mapped terrain months before they needed to cross it. When they finally arrived, and they always arrived, the battle was often already over in their minds. Their cavalry moved at speeds that European armies considered physically impossible. Light horsemen could cover 150 kilometers in a single day. Their composite bows made from horn, sinew, and wood, laminated together over years of careful craftsmanship, could punch through armor at distances that made return fire almost useless. They attacked in fluid, shape-shifting formations that had no fixed front, no rigid center, no clear vulnerability. They were not a wall you could push against. They were water, and water always finds a way through. The Mongols under Batu Khan, Genghis's grandson, had already torn through the Rus principalities like a storm through paper. Kiev, one of the great cities of the medieval world, was reduced to ash and bone in 1240. The armies of Poland and Hungary were shattered in a single spring campaign. Scouts were already mapping routes into France, into Italy, into the soft underbelly of Western Europe. Nothing had stopped them. Nothing even slowed them. Until now. The Second World is older, colder, stranger. The Norse world, the world of the Scandinavian peoples, the Vikings as history would call them, was not an empire. It was never an empire. It had no vast bureaucracy, no centralized command, no single king who could order a unified army into the field. What it had was something harder to map and infinitely harder to destroy. It had a culture of consequence. From the time a Norse child could understand language, they were raised on a cosmology that treated death not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a frame through which life was given meaning. The Old Norse myths are saturated with a concept scholars call fated doom, the understanding that even the gods themselves would one day fight and lose at Ragnarok. Odin, the Allfather, the wisest being in existence, already knew how the world would end, and he spent eternity preparing for that battle anyway. What do you do with warriors raised on that story? How do you psychologically break a man who already believes that loss is built into the fabric of existence and has chosen to fight magnificently regardless? The Norse warrior culture expressed itself in a social system built around honor, martial excellence, and the afterlife as recruitment. Dying in battle was not failure. It was selection. Valkyries descended to gather the worthy from the fallen, and those warriors were taken to Valhalla, a great hall where they would feast, fight, and prepare for the final war at the end of time. This is not metaphor to them. This is cosmological law. A Norse warrior walking into a hopeless battle was not being reckless. He was being rational, by the internal logic of his entire civilization. They were also, crucially, extraordinarily skilled at close-range, shield-to-shield, grinding combat. Viking warfare was intimate and brutal. The shield wall, the famous Skjaldborg, was a formation of overlapping shields, shoulder to shoulder, each man protecting the man beside him. It was tight, suffocating, and terrifyingly effective against cavalry. Horses, regardless of how brave their riders are, will not willingly run into a wall of sharp metal at close range. The Norse understood this. They had also, for centuries, been conducting raids in environments that would kill most armies before the enemy even arrived. The fjords of Norway, the frozen coastlines of Iceland, the rivers of what is now Russia. These were places where nature was the first and most dangerous opponent. A culture forged in that landscape does not produce soft soldiers. Two worlds, two philosophies, two systems of violence, one collision. The specific encounter that historians and researchers point to comes through a fractured but persistent record. Mongol forces probing the northeastern frontiers of what is now Russia and the Baltic region encountered Norse-descended fighters. Varangians, the Norse mercenaries and settlers who had established trade routes in eventually entire principalities across the rivers of Eastern Europe. The Varangians were, in every meaningful sense, Vikings who had moved east. They had come first as traders, navigating the great river systems, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, in their long, shallow draft ships. They came for silver, for furs, for amber. They stayed because the land was rich and the opportunities were extraordinary for men willing to defend their gains with axes. Over generations, they became rulers. The Kievan Rus, the civilization that the Mongols had just finished destroying, was in significant part a Norse foundation, built on a Viking framework and then layered with Slavic culture, Byzantine Christianity, and centuries of river trade. But before Kiev fell, before the great cities burned, the Varangians had developed their most famous export, the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard of Constantinople was, without question, the most elite standing military unit in the medieval world. Selected from the best warriors of Scandinavia and the Rus lands, armed with the iconic two-handed Dane axe, a weapon that could split a cavalry horse from neck to shoulder in a single stroke, and trained in the close-quarter fighting doctrine that Norse culture had refined over centuries, they were the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor. When Byzantine historians describe them, the language is almost reverent. They speak of men who seemed indifferent to wounds, men who, when injured, grew quieter rather than louder, more focused, not less. Men who had a relationship with violence so normalized, so culturally integrated, that the white noise of battle seemed to make them calmer. These are the fighters that Mongol advance scouts, pushing west and north in the years following the destruction of Kiev, began to encounter in the forests and frozen plains. And the Mongol scouts came back with reports that their commanders had never received before. These ones do not break. The precise battle is not recorded with the clean certainty of a major campaign. History at the margins is always like this, written by the victors, lost in fires, fragmented across languages. But what we have are consistent patterns in the chronicle record, in Mongol military history, and in Norse and Byzantine sources that paint a picture so coherent it demands to be taken seriously. Mongol forces, moving to consolidate control over the northern territories, encountered a fortified position held by Varangian and Norse-descended fighters. The Mongol commanders did what they always did. They sent cavalry probes to test the flanks, dispatched archers to soften the enemy formation, and waited for the psychological collapse that always preceded a real defense's failure. It did not come. The arrows fell. Men went down. The shield wall closed around the gaps like a living thing. each man sliding sideways to fill the space, the formation tightening rather than widening under pressure. The Mongol cavalry charged. The horses shied at the last moment, refusing the wall of axe heads and iron-bossed shields. The riders who forced their mounts through were pulled from their saddles by hand, dragged into the formation, and killed close. So close that the famous Mongol advantage in reach and speed became meaningless. And then the Norse warriors did something that no enemy of the Mongols had done in living memory. They counterattacked, not with the desperate lunge of men trying to run, not a retreat disguised as aggression, a real, organized, grinding forward movement. Shields locked, axes swinging in coordinated overhead arcs, advancing into the Mongol lines with the mechanical calm of men who had already decided how this day would end and were simply executing the decision. The Mongol psychological doctrine depended on the enemy's fear. Fear made men run. Running men were slaughtered from horseback. The cycle of pursuit and massacre that had ended 100 campaigns relied on that fundamental moment when the human survival instinct overrode military discipline. These men had a survival instinct that had been culturally rewired. Their mythology had replaced the fear of death with the fear of dying badly. A Norse warrior in a shield wall, pushing forward, axe in hand, dying on his feet, that was not a tragedy. That was the point. That was the entire purpose toward which a life of training and sacrifice had been aimed. The Mongols, for perhaps the first time in the era of their conquests, encountered a system they could not hack. They could break the formation physically. They were still ferocious, still brilliant, still operating with tactical sophistication that dwarfed most medieval armies. But every time they broke a section, the Norse response was not panic. It was fury. The famous berserkers, elite warriors who had either trained themselves into or perhaps been selected for a capacity to enter a hyper-aggressive battle state, became activated not when the odds improved, but when the odds worsened. The worse the situation, the more dangerous these men became. The Mongols understood war as a system. They had spent generations developing doctrine for breaking systems. But you cannot break a system that becomes more coherent under pressure. You cannot fracture a culture that has already philosophically processed its own destruction. By the time the engagement was over, the Mongol commanders pulled back their forces, not routing, not shattered, but reconsidering. The intelligence they sent back to the Great Khan was clear. These enemies require a different approach, and for an empire that had never needed to reconsider its approach before, that message was seismic. The Mongols were not cowards. They were not suddenly incompetent. They did not lose the War of the Northern Forests because their tactics failed. They pulled back because they were intelligent. And that is perhaps the most unsettling thing about this story. The Mongol Empire at its peak was a meritocracy of violence. The best thinkers rose. The best tacticians survived. And the best tacticians, when they encountered something they did not fully understand, did not simply throw more cavalry at it. They observed. They recalibrated. They came back when they had a better plan. But they never came back to the Norse North with the same ferocity they had brought to China, to Persia, to the Rus. Historians debate the reasons. The forests were unsuitable for cavalry. The cold was extreme. The strategic value was limited compared to the Silk Road cities and grain-rich plains to the south. All true, all relevant. But underneath those practical considerations is something quieter and more philosophically interesting. The Mongol Empire was built on a specific kind of terror, not random cruelty. Mongol commanders were actually remarkably pragmatic about when to use mercy and when to use brutality. They offered surrender terms. They rewarded collaboration. They built functioning administrative systems in conquered territories. The terror was calibrated. It was a tool, and the Norse warriors revealed the limit of that tool. Terror, as a weapon, requires that your enemy value their own survival above all else. The moment you encounter a culture that has genuinely restructured its relationship with death, not as a performance, not as bravado, but as a deeply encoded cosmological belief, the weapon loses its edge. The Norse were not fearless. They were afraid of all the things that sensible people are afraid of: cold, pain, loss, failure. But they had been taught in the deepest grooves of their identity that there are things worse than dying. Dying without meaning, dying having retreated, dying in a way that no skald would ever sing about. They had built an entire civilization around the idea that the quality of your death reflects backward on the quality of your life. And against that, the Mongol calculation simply did not compute. Two empires, one encounter. And what remains is not a monument or a treaty or even a clearly named battle in a clearly dated chronicle. What remains is a question: what is the actual nature of invincibility? The Mongols were, by every measurable standard, more powerful than the Norse forces they encountered. Larger numbers, superior mobility, centuries of developed military doctrine, an empire behind them, a supply chain, a strategic vision that encompassed the entire known world, and they still recalculated. Because power, real power, the kind that reshapes the world rather than simply moving through it, is not purely physical. It is not just about who has the bigger army or the better weapons or the more sophisticated tactics. It is about whose story is more durable. The Mongols had a story that said, "We will conquer everything." And for generations, that story was true. But it was a story that required the world to cooperate. It required enemies who could be broken. It required every opponent to, at some level, believe that survival was the most important thing. The Norse had a different story, a darker one in many ways, a story that ended at Ragnarok, in loss, in fire, in the death of gods, but a story that said, even so, we fight. Even knowing the end, we build the shield wall. Even in the frost, we take one more step forward. There is something in that, something that perhaps says more about the human condition than either empire ever intended. We live in a world that is constantly measuring power. Bigger armies, larger economies, more advanced technology, faster systems. And these things matter. They are not nothing. But every so often, somewhere at the edge of the map, in a forest no empire thought worth considering, a smaller force with a stranger story holds its ground. Not because it was stronger, not because it was smarter, but because it had decided something about what it was willing to lose and what it was not. The snow covered that battlefield centuries ago. The names of the Norse fighters who held the line have been swallowed by time. The Mongol commanders who sent back those unusual reports are footnotes in footnotes. But the thing that happened between them, that brief, frozen moment when the most powerful military machine in the world looked across a shield wall at men who were not afraid of it, that moment echoes. It echoes in every context where a prepared, resource-dominant system encounters something its models did not account for. It echoes every time an institution discovers that the people it expected to capitulate have instead decided to endure. The Mongols built the largest empire in history. The Norse built sagas. And somehow, impossibly, in this one cold corner of the world, on one particular day lost between memory and myth, the sagas held. Power assumes the world is afraid of it. The world is not always afraid.